All right, welcome back to SCI TV, Sports Conflict Advantage. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Professor Dr. Gary David from Bentley University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so you and I always have incredible conversations when we get to talk. What I'd love to do today is have you give a little background about some of the things that you are spending your time researching and focusing in on, especially around design thinking.
hmm
And then I'm going to see if we can see how that applies to the areas of sport conflict, dispute resolution, make some sense of it all, if that works for you.
Sounds fantastic. A little bit about me, as you mentioned, professor of sociology and experience design at Bentley University, which is just outside of Boston in Waltham, Massachusetts. Been there now coming on 26 years. This is my 26th year there. And it has afforded me the opportunity to find unique ways of blending arts and sciences and social sciences into business and primarily into the area of experience design. And for those who might not know what that means, experience design is really percolating in a lot of different spaces today, from customer experience to user experience, employee experience, patient experience, and even fan experience and sports experiences. And so experience design really is about the intentional creation, curation of experiences for particular audiences to create some kind of positive memory or positive outcome. And so when we think about experience design, especially from a stakeholder model, we're thinking about how can we kind of integrate all the different players, pardon the pun, that are involved so that we can create experiences that work as best as possible for all of those persons in the experience ecosystem.
Yeah, and so you've got some athletic credentials as well,
Yeah.
having an athletic background. So I think it's particularly interesting to think about how we take some of this thinking that you've got going on and put into a space where often we haven't put that kind of intentionality, especially when we hit those intersections where things start to go off the rails a little, where opportunities are truncated, where we've got seasons lost, we've got coaches' jobs at risk, we've got other stakeholders in disarray. This kind of experience by purpose, experience by design that you're talking about seems to have a real strong place to play in this space.
Yeah, and it can, as you mentioned, have a little bit of athletic background. I mean, we used, very amateur, nothing that remarkable, but I also have done things like put on bike races and as a race promoter in a particular discipline called cyclocross. And just real quick about experience design, one of the things that I did for the experience of those involved had nothing to do with the racers themselves. It was looking at the pain points that existed in the experience for the racers and for anybody else who was there. So, for instance, a person shows up, they're there with their family, they have their kids in tow, their partner, and while they're racing, what do the kids and the partner do? So I thought, well, maybe I should just go and make a arts and crafts table, right? Just went to a store, got some arts and craft supplies, photocopied some things with, for coloring that had bikes on them, put my daughters to work doing hair dyeing and face painting and all of that. And it was a major hit, not because it had anything to do with the race course or the registration or the officials or the cost or parking, but what was one of the things that was a pain point? Who was it impacting? How could I expand out the opportunity to make for better experience? And people were really appreciative. And it's like that kind of, at times keeping it simple, but trying to find ways that are most impactful for particular parts of the journey. You talk about journey mapping, so that we can deliver something that overall, helps everybody involved.
That's a great example. And I was actually thinking today, I was reading in your back neighborhood news rag in the Boston Globe,
Mhm.
was talking a bit about the LPGA
Mm,
and what they've been doing around having a roving child care center at all
yeah.
of their events. I just thought, again, what a no-brainer, but what a difference maker that must make for the experience for the athletes.
And you're not, it's interesting you mentioned LPGA because the person I would put these races on with, a man by the name of John Loppheimer, his father was president of the PGA at one time and was responsible for kind of bringing them into public consciousness through media deals. So I'm not saying there was a direct correlation, but yeah, I mean, it's, you know, when you come at things as an athlete, you approach it with that lens. If you're going to run Boston or you're going to do a bike race, you're approaching it from the lens of what do I have to do to perform the best? Sometimes what increases the performance is not directly related to the activity itself, but related to the peripheral things that affect the activity, like childcare, like a craft table, like, you know, how many porta potties do you have? You know, all these things that go into trying to reduce the friction in the external parts of the experience so that the friction, the challenge can be applied to the activity itself. We don't do sports because they're easy. We do them because they're challenging, but we don't need challenges that are outside of the activity because that just becomes a distraction.
It's a great point. And so I start thinking as you talk about all the different stakeholders involved across the sport ecosystem, everything from the governance side to the commercial side.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you hear the word experience thrown around a lot. Fan experience, I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a fair amount of attention, especially around major events, about what can we do to create the ripple effect around the fan experience. And you get lip service often around athlete experience.
Mm-hmm.
Some do it well, perhaps. Maybe the Olympic Village has a good athlete experience. But other areas, right? Let's pick on the college sports landscape for a moment.
All right.
Everyone talks about the student athlete experience and providing an exceptional experience, but what does that mean and how would you ensure that that's true?
I think it depends, you know, not to get too much into the weeds, but I work at a D2 school, Division two school. We have a Division one hockey team, but primarily we're Division two. A very different landscape in terms of student athlete experience than what you would get at a University of Oregon or someplace like that. And so I think number one, from an experience design perspective, it's getting specific about the context in which we're operating, right? When I teach courses on design experiences, I talk about the experience ecosystem and thinking about who's involved. Like our game day for football is nothing like the game day you have at a major Division one program. Our alumni aren't concerned about bowl appearances. Our students may not even go to the games. And so, what are we providing for the student athlete in terms of not necessarily furthering their athletic career? Although I did one time have a student by the name of Mackenzie Bernadou who did go on to play the NFL. So I have had one NFL player in my 26 years at Bentley. But most of the time, you know, these are things that the students are doing in order to, because they love the sport. Maybe they're getting a little money, probably not, but they love the sport. They love their teammates, they love the camaraderie, they love the competition, and but they're really there for an education. All right. I mean, that's the primary thing they're there for. And so that experience needs to be approached differently than perhaps an experience at a major program where there are other factors involved, right? And when we think about the perspective, that's another important part of experience design. The student perspective, the parent perspective, the athlete perspective, the faculty perspective, the alumni perspective, the corporate perspective, the coach perspective, on and on and on. You know, the governing body perspectives, you know, our former governor, Charlie Baker, you know, being in charge of the NCAA. All of these things are part of that experience ecosystem. So a good experience designer is thinking about all of those things, taking that complexity, finding opportunities for action, and trying to find ways of synthesizing and integrating, aligning those different channels to create as good of an experience as possible. Not that you're going to please everybody, but that at least you're aware and intentionally designing and making conscious decisions and knowing how they might impact those different parties.
Yeah, it's a great point. And so let's assume you're an athletic director for one of these big time, power four. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
leave the power five out of it for right now, the power four programs. And you want to make sure that as your coaches go out and they do their recruiting, that those are not hollow words,
Mm-hmm.
that we don't hear from student athletes, well, I was told my experience was going to be X, Y, or Z, but it was actually something quite different when I got there. That was just about
Right.
recruiting, getting me to come there. How do you ensure that, if anything, you're exceeding the experience of what you expected, not having to be a drastic drop off from what maybe was promised?
When I talk about experience design and experience engineering in my classes, you know, just like an engineer of any kind, you have to break it down into component parts. So I talk about, you know, what are the expectations coming in? are we evaluating the expectations, not only of what our recruiter might have said, but also what they're familiar with just in general. I mean, if you're watching ESPN or some other network, are you looking at the facilities at another institution? Are you hearing from players that went on that you used to play with? Or if you're playing AAU, there's that network. What are they hearing from others about what they're experiencing at their schools? So, what are the expectations? What are the interactions that are taking place, right? What are those touch point encounters and what do they look like? What are the perceptions that are created after those expectations meet with those interactions? And how are those things perceived by the parties involved? What are the emotions and the memories involved, right? What are emotion drives memory very often, right? And so, positive or negative, are we mapping the emotions along the journey? What is a sense of belonging? What drives a strong experience is a strong sense of community and belonging. We know that when we experience things together, they can be felt more intensely. So, how does a sense of belonging, not only in the team, but maybe on the side of the ball you're playing, the team itself, the student body, and also in a larger community and network of alumni or whoever else? And then what are the ethics that we're also involved, the morality, the ethics, and the justice implications. And some of that is regulation, obviously, but some of it is also just how do we differentiate ourselves in how we treat the players that we have? And how are we really putting being athlete centric, right? Not program centric, athlete centric. And how are we doing things in a way that best benefits the athlete? And those things will start to speak for themselves and we'll create athlete ambassadors because we'll know we're delivering the best experiences possible. And that word will get out and we'll be in a better position to attract more.
And what would your dashboard look like to ensure that that's all going well? What kind of measures are you looking at? What kind of behavioral indicators are you looking to?
I am a very strong believer in mixed methods research. And so some of it is not neatly going to be put into a dashboard. I mean, obviously, there's all kinds of tools out there that one could use to do a kind of, rather than net promoter score, maybe a net athlete score. I know the NFL puts out a survey, anonymous survey to its players to rank essentially the experience of the players in the NFL on a number of criteria. So there's surveys we can do, right? There's interviews we can do. We can do exit interviews. We can, if depending upon how we want to conceptualize success, right? Because it depends on how you define success. Is it, performance? Is it grades? Is it absences? Are we using other kinds of mental health indicators? I mean, there's any number of things that we could use, but I do think that if we try to reduce it to a single factor, like a net promoter score, and for those who don't know, think about on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this product, good, or service to a family or friend? That's net promoter score. If we reduce it to a simple singular measure, then we're really going to miss out on the complexity. And so that's where the qualitative stuff comes in. Captain's conversations. Are we talking to people who didn't come? Can we get information from them? Can we talk to them? Can we talk to people who transferred and do kind of like an exit interview, like in any kind of job? Are we talking to alumni 2, 5, 10 years out and trying to get a sense of likelihood of success or success indicator? So there's a lot. And I think that schools who really want to take a proactive approach need to be thinking in terms of this mixed methods and a lot of different data points because it's a complex picture, you need to have a lot of data to give you a 360-degree understanding.
Yeah, that makes good sense. I would say the NCAA, one of the things they do particularly well is a degree of research on what's going on in their landscape. And so they look at student athlete experience. And what you start to see, if you look at it from that perspective, is some real concerning data. So you see things like, 60% of the plus of the folks who transfer because of issues with their coach or
Mm-hmm.
teammates, conflict. They list this as a major reason for why they don't stick around. And the other one being mental health, mental well-being is up in the high
Right.
40s, right? And so those are two pretty concerning data points to know that people are leaving
Yeah.
and they're not having the experience they wanted. At the same time, you also have a pressure point where their colleagues, the general student population, and then others who care about what they're doing on their inside their sport, they tend to think they have it incredibly great, right? They go, wow, you look, you have this amazing experience, you travel all
Yeah.
around, you play these sports at the high level. And so you're also getting that cognitive dissonance between the expectation of what their experience is like and what they're actually feeling like they're experiencing. How do you start to unravel some of those and start to get it back to a more consistently great experience for the student athlete?
Yeah, I think, going back to, we're talking about the student athlete here, but I don't know. Who is one person in this ecosystem that student athletes probably talk to a lot in an unfiltered way? I'm going to guess it might be the trainers, right? Not the head trainer, but I'm like, who's taping your ankle? Who's helping you in the ice bath? Who's doing e-stem? That would be I'm always interested in who are the people that are closest to those I'm interested in understanding. And usually, not always, but if you move down the org chart, you're going to get richer information. It reminds me of the movie The Breakfast Club, where the janitor is like, I know everything that goes on here, right? How often do we think about the janitor as being a key source of information? Probably not much because they're not represented in the org chart at a high level. So it becomes really important if you really want to understand what's going on in this complex environment and kind of teasing out all these different perspectives, to not just focus, if we're looking at the student athlete experience, well, who else is associated with that? And how can we use those data points as well? Canaries in the coal mine to let us know what's going on. And, one of the things I've done in my sociology of sports classes that I've taught, and even my experience design classes, is talk to student athletes. And you'll find out, and the other students find out very quickly, that they're the ones working the hardest on campus. At least, again, we're talking about D2 schools, right? They got to buy they have these backpacks. They paid for them. They have these sweats that they wear around. They paid for them. Their field hockey sticks, $400. They paid for them. And so I think part of that is increasing the dialogue and the conversation. Again, it's going to be different in Big Four, but those same approaches can be used. And I'll say really quickly, there's an old axiom: people don't quit their organization, they quit their manager. And at youth sports, why do kids leave youth sports? Because it becomes not fun and they don't like their coach. So how different is it, right? I mean, so we can even expand out, even though it's a higher stakes world in which we have a lot more resources being devoted to it, these principles still are the same, right? That we have to look at those same kind of factors that we would look at employee experience in the athlete experience as well, because there is that working relationship that is going to dictate the kind of experience they have.
And you're absolutely right. The trainers know everything.
Yep.
The other group that knows everything are the academic advisors. Those are
Yep.
the folks who spend a lot of time with the student athletes. They're trusted,
Yep.
right, by the student athletes, and they tend to have pretty aligned interests in what's going on there. There are a lot of pressure points on that experience. So now we have a prevalence of gambling around them.
Yeah.
And this is not just the D1 sports, but D2, D3 had the highest jump in gambling.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So apparently, the less good information flows, the more gamblers like it because they can, I guess, benefit. I'm not a gambler myself, but I do
Me
see
either.
the consequences of it. So, one of the things we used to talk about with the student athlete experience was dealing with the issue of isolation
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that student athletes had a fully integrated experience like what you're describing at D2. Increasingly in D1, that becomes bad advice because you'll have a student athlete walk into the classroom and have a colleague say, "Hey, you lost me a bunch of money on Saturday when you made that error in the field."
Yeah.
And you can imagine how that changes the experience, not just as a student athlete, but as a student, to walk around knowing that someone may have lost money on you and they're telling you to your face. Not to mention all of the harassment. And there's another great study right now at the NCAA about the incredibly vile harassment that athletes are facing, especially during tournaments, basketball tournament being one, often racist comments, misogynistic
Sure.
comments. And again, mostly fueled out of gambling, but sometimes others. So, there's a lot of threats to the experience here.
I think about, it's funny because, again, being at a D2 school, We have very good athletics. This is no shot at any of the achievements of our teams because they've done very well. I can't walk across campus and go, that person's on the football team. They don't stand out, right? Physically, they don't stand out. They're because it's not a big school. But I went to a D1 school, Central Michigan University, go Chips, and you could tell who were the athletes because they were physically distinctive. And so if you figure you go through your entire life in many ways being physically distinctive, by definition, there's going to be some isolation that goes along with that. Yeah, there's pros that go along with it in terms of succeeding and being, picked first for the team and all of these accolades. But at the same time, that cuts both ways. And so you talk about, the mental health aspect of athlete experience and what are we trying to achieve? That's the number one thing. What are we trying to achieve? What are you trying to do? Is it about, going back to employee experience, is it solely about profitability? If it's solely about profitability, then you don't care about how you treat your employees because those employees are just, what do we call them? Human resources, right? That term. If all you care about is wins, and I understand why coaches would be concerned about that because that's the metric you're judged by. Did I win or lose? Right? And if you show me a metric, I'll show you behavior. If I want to understand the behavior, let me look at the metrics. And so if that's the thing that you're being hold accountable for by alumni, by donors, by sponsors, by whoever, the president of the institution, then yeah, you're going to get treating athletes as human resources. If you use different metrics, right, then you're going to be treating those athletes differently. And it's easy for me to say, it's a very, the gambling, the tournament money, I get it, right? There's a lot going on. But at the same time, if we have the best interest in these kids at heart, I know they're young adults, but these kids at heart, then we really need to start thinking about the athlete experience from athlete centricity and not just from program centricity. Just like when we talk about employee experience, it's employee centricity and not just the organization itself. They're not human resources, they're people, they're humans. And so how do we treat them better by creating better experiences?
So my argument is always, if you want to win, you have to do exactly what you're saying, that you have to treat folks where they're at. You have to figure out where their motivational profile is, what's
Mm-hmm.
meaningful to them, and work from that. Even if there are behaviors you need people to do in order to win, how do you get there unless you figure out what's really driving their passion? And we're long past the day of just doing it through hierarchy alone, right? The coach may have the authority, but we are very much in an athlete-centered era, which I think is
Right.
progress.
Yeah, with the
But
transfer portal, I mean, people can leave. It's not like you're signing up for, your army recruiter and you're dedicating your life for 4 years. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that changes the nature of the game in terms of athlete centricity. But I would also say, right, that that doesn't mean that the athletes are dictating the terms of everything. It's how do we have frank and honest and transparent conversations about decisions that are made so that when decisions that are made that may be contrary to the request or desires of the athletes, they understand why. We've all been in situations where we might have called a customer service representative or tried to get something done on a return or a rebate or an exchange or something like that. And we may not have gotten the answer that we wanted, but we felt good about the interaction because of the way that the dialogue progressed between you and the person on the other end of the line or across the counter. So the experience isn't determined by the outcome. The experience is determined by the interaction, expectations, interactions, and perceptions, which then create memories, emotions, and memories. And so we have to not just say, well, that means we're going to do everything they ask. No, it means that when we don't do what they want, that we're able to explain the reason why and be transparent about our own reasoning and and motivation behind making the decision we did.
so when I listen to what you're saying, part of what I'm hearing is that if you want to have competitive advantage in the modern era of sport, you need to be able to understand these concepts and be able to apply them in meaningful ways because we are not in an era of 20 years ago when it comes
Right.
to human performance.
Yeah, I would think so. This is why I think experience design has kind of been booming as an area of concern for organizations. Like I said, it's like, from the era of the game Mad Libs, right? I talk about noun experience, and you'll find somebody talking about it everywhere you go. I was recently went on a trip to the desert Southwest, and all I did was, for part of my trip, is take pictures of signs that had the word experience in it. And I got a lot of pictures. So, it's not just a marketing slogan, okay? Or it shouldn't be. If we're serious about experience design, if we're serious about being experience engineers, then we have to be intentional in our design approaches. This is where like design thinking comes in, participatory design comes in, collaborative design, design justice comes in, and how we try to use our understanding through our data collection, through understanding expectations and, you know, outcomes and all the things in between to create an intentional and curated experience that we also are able to shift and change based on our input and based on what we find, happening through the process.
So a lot of what you described is very preventative and very proactive, which I like. And I love that approach. But we all know that even when people do the best practices proactively, there are things that still go wrong from time to time. So I love this category of all the things you can do to be intentional on design, to prevent some of the problems and create a better experience with some purpose. With that said, we have to accept that there's going to be a certain amount of friction, especially in sport, built into it. And that's where my group often plays, is at these points of conflict. We are all for prevention, that's the goal. But then when they get into a point of conflict or dispute, we want to be able to make sure that we can preserve opportunities that people earned throughout their lifetime. So as you think about things ranging from ombudsing to mediation to negotiation to arbitration, how would you start to also apply some of those concepts? I know some of the themes probably hold true, but if you're to really specialize it to sports conflict in a way that coaches are going to accept, athletes are going to accept, you're going to have competent folks who can do it in a quick way, because mediation in a construction industry is going to look a lot different than for a big time athletic program.
Right.
How would you start to advise all the folks around that part of the ecosystem?
I would first look at what their expectations are, right? Starting from that basic thing. What are they expecting going in? I've done work in the criminal justice system. I've looked at, police interrogations and whether or not, confessions were falsely given, whether they're false confessions, whether they're valid confessions. And I've taught classes on criminal justice. And a sizable, there's a sizable population in the United States who expect no justice from the system. Going in, their expectation is pretty low based on their own prior experience, people they know, what they've read, what they've seen, what they've heard, right? So, what are their expectations going into the process? Both into the program and, you know, how do those expectations match with what actually took place? Having that ahead of time, you can tell me this, you're the one who does this work. Having that clearly articulated ahead of time can do a lot of the lifting in terms of hopefully avoiding conflict, right? Because no one feels like, I got, screwed over, I was sold a bill of goods, or it was unfair just like I expected. They can feel like, I was listened to, I knew what was happening going in, eyes wide open, and, it didn't go as I was hoping, but nevertheless, I understand the process as a transparent one. That's where I think you start, is by not getting into the situation of surprises as much as possible.
Yeah, so in my world, in my perfect world, every team has a charter that clearly explains roles, responsibilities, expectations. That charter is developed collaboratively. So some of it is some top-down expectations, but to the extent you can, you are doing behavioral assessment on your athletes. You're trying to figure out what drives them. You're doing some good input sessions, and you're coming up before the season begins about what are your array of goals.
Mhm.
Some of those goals, of course, are going to be on field, on pitch. Other goals are going to be more life goals that you want to support through that experience, right? We've done this with soccer teams where the coaches all say they want to win conference championship and do this, and you talk to the athletes and they're talking about making lifelong friendships.
Yeah,
You can do both,
right.
but you can't do both by accident. To your point, you have to design something where you can satisfy both, and you have to do it in a way where they're not working against each other, right? And then a big part of it too is to anticipate you're going to have conflict and figure out what your dispute system is going to look like. And that doesn't have to be a particularly formal process, but who can they trust to raise concerns to without retribution or fear of retribution? And then where can you quickly get support if you need it outside of your bubble? Because they're not always going to be able to go to a coach, as skilled as they may be, and have them serve as an impartial mediator to help between teammates or whatever. And all of that feels at times like a really foreign concept in sport. And it's a hard sell at times. Sometimes it's embraced and works. And other times people say, well, we don't do dispute resolution in sport. That's for everything else. And,
Right.
so my question back to you a bit is, in an industry that often prides itself on being at the cutting edge of innovation, it's often where technology first gets proven, right? You'll find a
Right.
frictionless way to get someone a beer by thinking about a beer in a stadium. But why, when it comes to other innovations like dispute resolution, are we running into that kind of friction? Because from my standpoint, it must be a design flaw if we're not getting folks that want to adopt it as universally as I would think would be healthy for the system.
Well, I think there's a few things. I think one of your example of the charter, which I kind of want to talk about a little bit, what are the measures of success? Why does the coach care about the conference championship? Is it just because they want to win the conference championship? Or is because there is, some kind of bonus tied to that level of performance? Is it a way of getting the next job? Is it a way of holding on to the present job? Where is that coming from? Right. So there's a book, talking about measure what matters. And I kind of flip it. It matters because you measure it. Right. If you measure something else, like, lifelong friendships 10 years after they graduate, where are they at? You know, how successful are they? What's their mental health like? If those are the measurements, then they will matter. If you don't measure those things, guess what? They won't matter as much from a performance standpoint. And so it's, what measures are we prioritizing and from whose perspective? I make videos on YouTube, educational videos, and one of the videos I have is what kind of designer are you? There's four kinds of design approaches I talk about. Designing at, for, with, and against. I am starting school next week. Syllabus day is the exact example of designing at. I didn't ask them what they wanted. I didn't ask them what topics they wanted to cover. I didn't ask them what books they wanted to read. I didn't ask them what assignments they wanted to have. I didn't ask them what they thought about it. I didn't ask them. I don't even know who they are. I created the syllabus and I will give it to them. And this is the charter. Some, you know, then you take another approach, and we can think about, professors who have been at it for a really long time and out of pace, and they're using old school models that they think worked. So they don't even think about the students. Designing for might be, well, what would motivate Gen Z today? What are their learning styles in this abstraction? Maybe I should, think about how I adopt materials based on who these kids are. Designing with is, and I've done this before, first day, I'm like, where do you want to be in the syllabus? What do you learn best with? Called, participatory syllabus design. What would make the most sense for you? We can't change the topic of the course. This is what it is. We need to have assignments. What, you write it to the extent of you write it up as a class, you give it to me. Designing against might be, you know what? We can't have too many majors in this program. So I need to have a class that's so hard that I'm going to weed people out. So I could take design at, for, with, and against and apply it to the first day of class as a design. And we could take that same thing to your example of athletics. Are we designing at? Well, this is what I think will work, and I'm going to do it as a coach or a program. Designing for, well, I'm using general research about what people might want, and I'm still going to design it, but I'm going to use it with them in mind, design thinking. Are we designing with? I'm going to have them be part of the design process. They're going to be involved in helping to develop what it is that we do, participatory design. or designing against, you know what, I'm going, one of those coaches who's going to make life miserable because for whatever reason. And so an athletic team is just design, right? Everything is designed in some way. What are we designing for? How do we intentionally do it? How do we apply social science so that we can avoid dispute, not have to worry about resolution, and also create an environment where we can succeed together?
And I think for folks like you and I who spend so much time thinking about this type of thinking, it seems pretty clear that you're going to be able to level up a broader array of athletes if you as a
Oh, yeah.
coach can meet them where they're at and then get the best of them rather than just dictating. And it's proven pretty well, but I would say still the vast majority of coaches out there that I encounter, even when well-intentioned, they're doing some version of, well, I was coached this way.
Yeah.
I thrived under it. Therefore, you will thrive under it because that's how I learned. We don't have a coach's academy where they're learning all the best practices generally. They're often learning through a mentor who did it at a different era, and now they've won some, so that's going to become self-perpetuating. And if they continue to win, it's going to be further self-perpetuating. And even if they could do better, as long as they're winning, they're not going to look very often to change, right? But we know the athletes that they're bringing in are changing and having different expectations of what that experience is going to be like.
Yeah, that winning can be fleeting, right? I mean, you think about companies that were like, well, what? We don't have to change anything. We've been doing it for this way for this long, and we're good. Kodak, right? I mean, why why do we need to change anything? It's always worked, right? Well, if you do business as usual, what happens when business is now unusual? And can you shift? And can you change? And can you move? And can you react? And culture is replicated through socialization. So, of course, coaches coach the way that they were socialized into it. This is why people who are, innovative thinkers take new approaches that are unproven and untested. And there needs to be support at the institutional level, right? Because it's not just a coach's decision. The coach doesn't live in isolation. The institution needs to support those approaches, those innovations, those shifts, and be willing to back whoever the coach is as they're doing this. Because again, we talk about the coaches, we talk about the athletes, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a school with all these, and those presidents, they're, that person's phone is ringing about stuff. And so you see, I have a lot of sympathy for everybody involved. And that's, as an experienced designer, I approach things not from a position of judgment, but from a position of understanding. Let me understand your worlds and what's driving your historic action so that we can figure out a system that can create new action and new outcomes.
Yeah, one of the things I've worked really hard to champion with athletic departments or organizations that I've worked with is to implement very safe communication platforms.
Right.
So there's one that's kind of an industry best practice where it's bidirectional, anonymous reporting anytime. You don't even need to download an app. It's just texting, and people outside of your team who you should trust, you know who they are, get to respond back and hear your concerns. Sometimes you'll never unmask yourself. You'll just say, hey, here are the concerns, and they'll figure out some dialogue that makes sense and what intervention might make some sense. Other times that after a little rapport builds, someone might say, hey, I actually want to meet in person and have a conversation about it. Or they may be coached up enough where they now have confidence to go to their coach and more directly provide that feedback. Initially, every organization where we've rolled this out has tremendous resistance about this. How could you possibly let that kind of information outside of the walls of our locker room, right? And yet, the experience of when you do that is that we eliminate the more fatal conflict. We reduce the bad reasons for why people transfer out of college organizations or quit teams and other
Sure.
organizations. We learn about things so early that we can actually do something about it. And sometimes it's silly stuff, right? But it's not silly to the person who reported it. If they say they hate the nutrition bar and that's bothering them, it's one of their strains of the games that are bothering them, and you can actually deal with it, it helps. right? It's like what we were just talking about, having childcare for the LPGA. It helps. It's not the everything. Talent's still going to prevail ultimately in some
Right.
ways, but you can create an environment where that experience is a competitive advantage.
If you leave something in the back of the refrigerator long enough, it's going to start to stink, right? So you got to kind of dig back there, and if you want to make sure that you know where the smell is coming from. And there's a in customer experience or user experience or employee experience or patient experience, there's this phrase of voice of the customer, voice of the employee, voice of the user, voice of the patient, voice of the student. So what about voice of the athlete? How do we capture that? But from an experience ecosystem perspective, from a systems perspective, what about the voice of the coaches? What about the voice of the trainers? What about the voices of the academic advisors? Voice of the fans? Whatever it might be. So how do we get these voices to understand the as is and then think creatively about the to be, rooted in what are we trying to accomplish as an organization who's creating this product, who's curating this product for those stakeholders. And that's where experience design comes in, getting the voice, getting the understanding. Ideally, I think getting those who we're targeting involved in the design process, and then trying to come up with a set of metrics that allow for our action to take place. Because there's nothing worse than giving people a mandate for action, but then having metrics that are misaligned with that. We don't care. We want to have a greatest student athlete experience, but we're going to hold you to wins. Well, okay, so you're telling me one thing, but you're measuring me in another way. That's really bad. Right? There's a lot of words I could think of for using what that is. Really bad because now you're saying one thing is strategy, but you're actually looking at success as another thing that's completely misaligned. So you got to make sure those metrics are aligned with what you're saying you want to be achieved.
So it sounds like, from your perspective, every administrator, every coach, every governing body should be begging for more ways to get that information flowing.
Absolutely. I mean, and if you have somebody internally who can do it, great. If not, having someone externally come in and kind of suss all this out. And in a way that is meaningful in the sense that it will result in outcomes. Because we've all taken part in the employee engagement surveys, for instance, right? And we all probably have no confidence that they're going to result in anything useful. Right. I'm just saying, just history has borne out that the employee engagement or employee experience survey is generally seen as useless because no one believes that anybody reads it or it does anything. And like, why bother? Why are you even asking me? So if you're going to commit to this kind of approach, you got to commit to it. And you got to make sure that whether it is the bars, right, as something as simple as the bars, you wanted this kind of bar, we're bringing that option next year. We can't do it this year, but we'll bring it in next year. Or something as bigger as we're going to have faculty advisors on each team. We're going to have alumni mentors, who played those sports that are, or mentors in fields that you're majoring in, or whatever it is. This is where it gets to be fun because the people who you're designing for can actually have a voice in the design of it. And that's where the blue sky thinking and the ideation can really take root, and they can feel invested in the process because they believe there's going to be a tangible outcome.
So final area of questioning here. Um, from your experience, what are the biggest barriers people have? Because to me, this all sounds so logical and such a no-brainer that this is going to improve everything about what you're doing in any of the roles that surround the sport ecosystem. What would you anticipate the biggest barriers are, and what do you say to help overcome some of those barriers?
Um, I think that sometimes asking these questions, people don't want to know the answers because once you know the answers, then you feel like you have to do something about it, right? It's like, again, if something, recently there was something smelling in my garage. Do I want to go find it? Because now I have to deal with it, some dead animal or something like that. Or do I just want to leave it alone and pretend it's not there? So I think one of the barriers is being afraid of what we'll find when we start to look, right? The other barrier is uh, change can be hard, especially if that change feels like I'm giving up some power. And so the athlete coach dynamic, if I'm giving power to the athletes in a way of participatory design, is it a zero sum game? And I don't believe it is. I think it, I can point to a lot of examples of where giving people input and agency actually gives you more power as a leader because you're held in higher esteem. But there's, the change element, the risk of losing power element, and just reconfiguring the metrics around how we traditionally define success because institutions are structured in traditional measurements. And when you start to change those measurements, right, you're fighting against that institutional organizational inertia that the institution was, is built upon. So those I think are the primary elements. How much time does it take? Well, it doesn't have to take much time to get the process rolling. So I don't believe it's a time, there are things called design sprints, right? There are simple ways of approaching these things that aren't longitudinally, have a long time horizon. Resources, well, again, I mean, like I tell companies, if it's a resource question, how much are you putting in resources to get the same results? It's just, it's like you're already putting resources towards not succeeding in ways that you say you want to. What about putting resources to succeeding? So I think a lot of it is just cultural, quite frankly. And but that not to undersell that, cultural change can be hard, but cultures will change with you or without you. It's better to be a leader to intentionally have cultural change than to have it change around you and have you get lost in the process.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. I think everything you're saying is widely applicable across sport. We're talking international, Olympic, collegiate, professional, and of course, our good friends in the youth movement here as well should
Yep.
be taking heed of this. If you want people to continue to stay in sport, to put their energy in sport, I think they need to be much more intentional in design. And thank you for taking some time to share your expertise today. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Happy to chat about it.